The scent of a forgotten century clung to her skin, a delicate perfume of linseed oil, aged canvas, and the ghost of turpentine. In the hallowed silence of the Sterling Foundation's restoration studio, long after the last footsteps of patrons had faded into the marble halls, Ilara Vance felt most herself. Or, at least, the version of herself she permitted to exist. At 24, her world was a universe contained within the few square feet of her workstation. Her fingers, steady and impossibly gentle, traced the fine craquelure of a 17th-century portrait, a web of fractures marring the painted cheek of a long-dead noblewoman. She wasn't just mending a painting. She was communing with its brokenness, understanding its fragility. It was a language she knew intimately, this art of repairing what the world had damaged, of making things whole again, even as a quiet, persistent hollowness echoed within her own chest. If you want to discover whether the woman who mends broken things can ever heal herself, watch until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel and comment on where you're watching from. We continue. Ilara's life was a meticulously curated collection of quiet moments and careful routines. She was an art conservator in training, a title that felt both prestigious and suffocatingly small. Her apartment, a third-floor walk-up several miles from the museum's opulent district, was as ordered and contained as her emotions. Each book was aligned, each surface was clear, a stark contrast to the beautiful chaos of her studio. This small, protected space was her sanctuary and her cage, a life lived in muted shades of gray and beige. She moved through the city like a whisper, her presence intentionally unobtrusive, her gaze often fixed on the pavement before her. It was a life built not on the pursuit of happiness, but on the careful avoidance of pain, a strategy that had thus far proven successful, if achingly lonely, leaving her feeling like a ghost haunting the edges of other people's vibrant lives. This profound caution was a legacy, a lesson etched into her soul by her mother's ruin. Ilara was a virgin, a fact she guarded not out of shyness or moral decree, but out of a deep, primal fear. Her mother had once been a woman of brilliant color and laughter, until she was swept into the orbit of a wealthy, charismatic man who promised her the world and left her with nothing but debt and a shattered spirit. Ilara had watched the light in her mother's eyes dim and then extinguish completely. That memory was the cornerstone of the fortress she had built around her heart. Powerful men in her mind were not saviors, they were architects of destruction. Intimacy was not a gift, it was a currency, a dangerous transaction where she stood to lose the very foundations of her carefully constructed self. Her entire philosophy was shaped by this inherited trauma. She believed that true beauty, whether on a canvas or in a person's soul, was something to be protected and revered, never possessed. This conviction made her exceptional at her job. She could spend 100 hours painstakingly readhering a single flake of paint, her patience a form of devotion. She saw the way the museum's wealthy donors looked at the masterpieces, with the cold, appraising eyes of conquerors. They saw assets, investments, conquests. Ilara saw silent stories, vulnerable histories, and fragile survivors. Her work was a quiet rebellion against that possessiveness. In the studio, she had a measure of control, a sacred duty to mend the wounds inflicted by time, neglect, and the carelessness of powerful hands, a power she felt utterly lacking in her own life. Yet, the safety she had engineered for herself was a cold comfort. In the quiet hours of the night, a profound sense of emptiness would wash over her. It was a silent ache, a longing for a connection she was too terrified to ever seek. She would stand at her small apartment window, watching the silhouettes of couples walking hand in hand under the streetlights, their easy intimacy feeling like a spectacle from another world. She was a spectator to life's most fundamental experiences, an expert on the anatomy of art, but a complete novice in the mechanics of the human heart. She was preserving herself so carefully, coating her own spirit in so many protective layers of varnish, that she feared one day there would be nothing left underneath to feel, just a hollow, beautifully preserved shell. Her world was defined by safe sensations. The soft drag of a sable hair brush against canvas, the weight of a magnifying loupe in her palm, the earthy scent of aging paper and pigment, these were her anchors. They were predictable, controllable, and they asked for nothing in return. This tangible reality stood in stark, terrifying contrast to the unpredictable chaos of human touch. An accidental brush of a stranger's arm on the crowded morning bus could send a jolt of pure panic through her system, her body recoiling as if from a flame. Every casual gesture of affection she witnessed felt like a threat, a prelude to the inevitable pain she had been taught to expect. Her hands, so capable of healing the inanimate, remained clenched in her pockets, terrified of the damage a simple, human connection might inflict. The Sterling Foundation itself was a monument to the very power she feared. It was a temple of glass and steel, its cold, imposing architecture, a constant reminder of the immense wealth that funded her quiet existence. The name of its benefactor, Alistair Sterling, was spoken in hushed, reverent tones by the staff, a reclusive, formidable figure who was more myth than man. Ilara had never seen him, but his presence was everywhere, in the flawless polish of the floors, the silent hum of the climate control systems, and the invisible pressure to be perfect. As autumn began to bleed into the city, an unfamiliar tension settled in the air, a subtle shift in the atmosphere of her controlled world. It felt like the low, distant rumble of a coming storm, a premonition that the quiet life she had so painstakingly preserved was about to be irrevocably fractured. Her small apartment was a testament to a life lived on the defensive, a fortress of meticulous order against the city's sprawling chaos. Every morning began with the same ritual, the precise measure of coffee grounds, the quiet click of the percolator, the way she aligned the sugar bowl with the edge of the counter. The floorboards, worn smooth by a century of anonymous footsteps, creaked a familiar song under her own careful tread. This space, with its pale walls and second-hand furniture, was her entire kingdom, a controlled environment where nothing was out of place. It was a stark, self-imposed quarantine from the unpredictable world that waited just beyond her window, a world of messy emotions and dangerous variables she was determined to keep at bay. The silence within these four walls was her most prized possession, a fragile piece bought with the currency of profound, suffocating loneliness. The daily commute was a journey across invisible, yet unbreachable, class lines. She would descend from her quiet, third-floor walk-up into the gritty pulse of her neighborhood, joining a river of anonymous faces on the crowded city bus. Here, she was nothing more than a fleeting reflection in the window, her gaze fixed downward to avoid catching anyone's eye. As the bus rumbled from the modest brick-lined streets of her district toward the gleaming steel and glass canyons of the city's financial heart, the very air seemed to change. The opulence of the Sterling Foundation's neighborhood felt like a foreign country. She would step off the bus and feel the weight of the immense wealth around her, a pressure that made her feel smaller, plainer, and utterly insignificant. A ghost slipping through the gilded gates of a world she served but could never belong to. Her grandmother's apartment was a museum of a different sort, one dedicated to memory, obligation, and the slow, relentless passage of time. The air was thick with the scent of lavender sachets, old paper, and the faint medicinal tang of her grandmother's various ailments. Unlike Ilara's spare, controlled space, every surface here was cluttered with a lifetime of accumulated objects, porcelain figurines, faded photographs in tarnished silver frames, stacks of yellowed letters tied with ribbon. Ilara moved through the cramped rooms with a practiced, gentle care, her visits a ritual of duty. She would plump the pillows, refill the water glass, and listen to the same stories, each visit weaving another thread into the suffocating tapestry of familial expectation that defined her existence. This place was the anchor of her guilt, the physical embodiment of the life she was expected to honor. A girl needs security, Ilara, not dusty old paintings, her grandmother would say, her voice as fragile and brittle as the teacup she held in her trembling hands. The conversations were always the same, a gentle but persistent erosion of Ilara's own quiet ambitions. Her grandmother, a woman whose world had been shattered by the aftershocks of her own daughter's ruin, saw Ilara's passion not as a calling, but as a frivolous distraction from the serious business of survival. Find a good, simple man, someone steady, you're not getting any younger. Each word was a small, sharp stone cast at the delicate fortress Ilara had built around her heart. It wasn't malice, but fear, a desperate desire to see her granddaughter safely locked away in a conventional life, far from the reach of powerful men and the dangerous allure of impossible dreams. The pressure was not merely emotional, it was a stack of crisp, white envelopes that arrived with damning regularity. Her grandmother's medical bills, the rent for both their apartments, the ever-present student loans, they formed a paper chain that shackled her to her modest salary. Alara would sit at her small kitchen table late at night, the single lamp casting a pool of light on the stark figures, her stomach tight with a familiar, cold dread. Every dollar was accounted for, every small luxury ruthlessly cut. This financial fragility was the true legacy of her mother's tragedy. It was a constant, grinding reminder that she could not afford a single misstep. A life of passion and risk was a privilege for those with a safety net. For Alara, life was a high wire, and the ground below was a hard, unforgiving reality she knew all too well. In a small, velvet-lined box on her dresser lay her mother's only remaining piece of fine jewelry, a simple silver locket, now tarnished with age. Sometimes Alara would open it, tracing the smiling face of the woman in the tiny photograph within, a woman with bright, hopeful eyes and a laugh that Alara could still faintly remember, like a distant melody. Then, the image would dissolve, replaced by the ghost her mother became, a hollowed-out woman who moved through their small home in a shroud of silence, her vibrant colors bleached away by grief and betrayal. That locket was a sacred relic and a terrible warning. It was proof that love could be a form of theft, that a man's promises could be the instrument of a woman's complete and utter erasure. It was the reason Alara kept her own heart under lock and key. Walking home from her grandmother's, Alara would move through the twilight streets of her neighborhood like a visitor from another plane. She'd see the warm, yellow squares of light in the windows of the small houses, catching glimpses of the lives within. A family gathered around a dinner table, a couple laughing on a front porch, a father teaching his child to ride a bike. These simple, domestic scenes of connection and belonging felt like dioramas in a museum of a life she would never lead. She observed them with a profound and aching sense of separation, as if she were watching a film in a language she couldn't understand. The world of easy intimacy, of casual touch and shared futures, was a territory she had been taught to fear, and she was an exile, forever looking in from the cold. This profound fear had solidified into a conscious, deliberate choice: her virginity. It wasn't a matter of religious conviction or outdated morality. It was a strategy, the ultimate act of self-preservation. In her mind, physical intimacy was inextricably linked to the concept of surrender, of giving a part of herself away that she might never get back. It was the transaction that had cost her mother everything. To Alara, her body was not a vessel for pleasure, but the last sovereign territory she controlled, the final wall of her fortress. The thought of allowing someone across that threshold, of granting them the power to potentially inflict the kind of wound that never heals, was a terror so deep and absolute that it eclipsed any flicker of curiosity or desire. It was a heavy, lonely shield, but one she never considered putting down. Even the Sterling Foundation, her supposed sanctuary, offered no real escape. As she worked late into the night, the vast, silent galleries became a gilded reflection of her own confinement. She was surrounded by breathtaking beauty, by masterpieces that whispered stories of passion, tragedy, and desire across the centuries. Yet this beauty was owned, catalogued, and controlled by the very kind of power that had dismantled her family. The name Sterling was etched into the marble walls, a constant, institutional reminder of the reclusive, formidable man whose immense wealth made her quiet work possible. The art was her passion, but the museum was his domain. She was merely a custodian in a palace built by a king she feared, polishing his treasures while her own life remained carefully and fearfully untouched. One evening, while cleaning the glass on a display case, she caught her own reflection. Her face, pale and tired under the track lighting, was superimposed over the stoic, painted features of a Renaissance noblewoman. For a long, silent moment, she saw herself as just another artifact, preserved, protected, and utterly static. She was trapped behind the glass of her own making, an object of quiet integrity but no real life. A wave of suffocating despair washed over her, the crushing weight of her grandmother's expectations, the endless cycle of debt, the fortress of her fears. Her future felt like a long, empty hallway, a life sentence of careful, lonely preservation. It was in that moment of profound entrapment that she felt the first, faint tremor of a coming earthquake, a deep, unsettling premonition that the foundations of her world were about to crack. The name Aleister Stirling was less a name and more a force, an invisible pressure that kept the museum's marble floors gleaming and its air perfectly climate-controlled. Ilara had never seen him, but she felt him in the hushed reverence of the curators and the palpable fear of the administrative staff whenever his office issued a directive. He was a myth, a ghost in the machine of his own creation. Whispers painted a picture of a man who had retreated from the world after a brutal, public betrayal, a man who now preferred the silent, unwavering loyalty of his art collection to the treacherous landscape of human connection. He was the king in a castle she was hired to maintain, a formidable, unseen presence whose wealth was both her salvation and a constant, unnerving reminder of the power she so deeply distrusted. Miles above the city, in a penthouse that was more sterile gallery than home, Aleister Stirling watched the world through panes of armored glass. His life was an algorithm of control, a fortress built of data streams and market predictions. He sometimes reviewed the security feeds from the Foundation, not out of concern for the art, but as a detached observation of his assets. The memory that had forged him was a flashbulb nightmare, the gleam of a diamond ring on a faithless hand, the predatory smiles of reporters, the public spectacle of his own vulnerability. He had surgically excised that weakness, cauterizing the wound with ambition and a profound, icy contempt for emotional entanglement. People were variables, unpredictable and prone to error. Art, on the other hand, was a perfect, silent investment, its value clear and its motives pure. On a moonless Tuesday night, an unusual restlessness propelled him from his glass tower. He dismissed his driver and walked the final blocks to the Foundation, entering through a private, unmarked door. The cavernous halls, empty of the public's shuffling feet and noisy awe, were his true sanctuary. He moved through the galleries with a predator's silent grace, his tall frame cloaked in a bespoke charcoal suit that seemed to absorb the low ambient light. His presence was an intrusion of absolute authority into the sleeping museum. Each footstep was a deliberate, soundless claim of ownership on the polished floors. This was his kingdom, built to house beautiful, broken things that could never betray him, a silent testament to a world he could possess without the risk of ever being possessed himself. It was the light that drew his attention, a soft, focused glow spilling from the open doorway of the restoration studio on the third floor, a violation, an imperfection in the carefully controlled darkness of his domain. A flicker of cold annoyance tightened his jaw. He expected to find a janitor being careless, or a security guard asleep on the job, an error that would be swiftly and ruthlessly corrected. He approached the doorway, his body instinctively hugging the shadows, his mind already composing the termination notice. The silence from within was absolute, but it was a working silence, a silence of intense concentration. He peered past the doorframe, his icy gaze narrowing as he saw not a uniformed employee, but a lone, slender figure hunched over an easel, utterly absorbed. From the unlit hallway, he watched her. He didn't register her as a woman, not at first. She was an element, a component of the scene. The worn cardigan draped over her chair, the loose strands of hair escaping a simple knot, the almost reverent stillness of her hands as they hovered over a 17th-century canvas. He saw an employee who had failed to adhere to the schedule, a minor disregard for protocol. Her very presence felt like an act of defiance, an unwelcome stain of humanity in his sterile, ordered world. There was a quiet intensity about her that was both insignificant and, to his surprise, irritatingly compelling. She was a puzzle piece that didn't fit, a soft, living thing in a room of preserved history, and his immediate instinct was to remove her. Ilara felt the change before she heard or saw anything. It was a sudden drop in the room's temperature, a shift in the density of the air. The familiar, comforting silence of her studio was no longer empty. It had been occupied by a heavy, judgmental presence. A primitive, animal instinct prickled the back of her neck, a feeling of being watched by something powerful and unseen. Her breath caught in her throat, and the fine-tipped brush in her hand froze mid-stroke, a millimeter above the canvas. Every nerve ending screamed a silent alarm. Slowly, hesitantly, She lifted her head from the magnifying loupe, her heart beginning a frantic, panicked rhythm against her ribs. She turned her head toward the doorway, her eyes straining to pierce the deep shadows of the hall. And then she saw him. He was a specter of dark, tailored fabric and sharp angles, a silhouette of imposing height framed perfectly in the doorway. He seemed to consume the light around him. As he took a single, silent step forward, the low gallery lighting caught the severe planes of his face, revealing a man of unnerving, cold beauty. But it was his eyes that seized her, that held her captive. They were a pale, arctic gray, devoid of warmth or curiosity, holding only a chilling, analytical intelligence. It was like looking at a wolf that had wandered into a library. In that instant, Elara's blood ran cold. He was the abstract fear she had lived with her entire life, made real, standing in the one place on earth she had considered safe. He didn't speak. The silence stretched, becoming a tangible thing, a weapon he wielded with absolute mastery. He let his gaze drift from her wide, startled eyes down to the delicate, painstaking work on the easel, then to the array of tiny tools and solvent bottles on her workstation. It was a slow, deliberate act of assessment, the way a king might survey his territory, his eyes cataloging every detail, judging its worthiness. He was not seeing her. He was processing an anomaly in his system. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with an unspoken power imbalance so profound that Elara felt it as a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders, making it difficult to breathe. She felt small, exposed, and utterly transparent under his cold, dissecting stare. When he finally spoke, his voice was not loud, but it cut through the silence with the sharp, clean sound of breaking ice. The foundation closes at 5. It was a statement, not a question, delivered in a low, resonant baritone that held no room for discussion. The words were clipped, impersonal, and laced with an unmistakable edge of dismissal. He didn't ask who she was, what she was doing, or why she was still there. He simply stated a rule she had broken, a boundary she had crossed. His tone instantly relegated her to the status of a malfunctioning part, an inconvenience to be corrected. For Elara, that voice was the embodiment of every cold, dismissive authority figure she had ever encountered, a sound that confirmed her insignificance. Without waiting for a response, he turned with an almost imperceptible pivot and vanished back into the shadows of the hallway as silently as he had appeared. He left behind a vacuum, a profound and unnerving chill that the warm studio lights could not dispel. Elara remained frozen in her chair, her hand still hovering over the canvas, her entire body trembling. The air was still charged with his presence, carrying the faint, clean scent of something expensive and masculine, sandalwood and cold ambition. She stared at the empty doorway, her heart hammering a frantic, painful rhythm. The encounter had lasted less than a minute, yet it had fractured the peaceful solitude of her world. A terrifying, unwelcome seed of fascination began to sprout in the dark soil of her fear. The ghost of his presence haunted her studio for days. Elara found herself glancing at the empty doorway, half expecting his dark, imposing form to reappear in the shadows. His voice, a low baritone that had seemed to vibrate in the very molecules of the air, replayed in her mind, each clipped word a small, sharp shard of ice. She tried to rationalize the encounter, to reduce him to a simple category, a demanding, reclusive billionaire, a cold boss who expected his rules to be followed. But it was the memory of his eyes, those pale, analytical gray eyes that had stripped her bare without a flicker of human warmth, that she couldn't dismiss. They had not just seen her, they had assessed, judged, and dismissed her in a single chilling moment. The sanctuary of her studio now felt compromised, its peaceful silence tainted by the lingering memory of his absolute, unnerving power. Her work became a frantic, desperate attempt to reclaim her focus. She poured all her energy into the delicate craquelure of the canvas, hoping the familiar, methodical process would soothe the new, ragged edge on her nerves. Yet, even the familiar scent of linseed oil and varnish seemed different, now layered with the phantom expensive scent of him. She became hyper-aware of every sound in the museum beyond her door, the distant echo of footsteps, the hum of the ventilation, the soft chime of an elevator. Each noise brought a fresh jolt of adrenaline, a primal fear that he was nearby. He had become more than a man. He was an idea, a walking embodiment of the oppressive force she had structured her entire life to avoid. This new, constant state of alert was exhausting, a low-grade fever of anxiety that left her feeling exposed and vulnerable in her own skin. Weeks later, a memo circulated, its crisp, embossed letterhead announcing the annual Sterling Foundation donor dinner. It was an exclusive, opulent affair designed to coax millions from the city's elite. Alara's supervisor informed her that her presence was required. She would not be a guest, of course, but a part of the exhibit, stationed near the newly restored Renaissance wing to answer any technical questions about the conservation process. The news landed like a stone in her stomach. It was a command performance, forcing her into the very heart of the world she despised, a room filled with the kind of casual, predatory wealth that had consumed her mother. The thought of standing there, a living placard for the Foundation's work, while surrounded by the polished, smiling faces of the powerful, felt like a special kind of torture, a public exhibition of her own insignificance. The night of the dinner arrived like a slow-motion execution. Alara wore her only presentable dress, a simple, dark blue sheath that felt like both armor and a confession of her modest means. The ballroom was a dizzying spectacle of shimmering gowns, glittering diamonds, and the low, confident murmur of immense wealth. She stood by a display case, her posture rigid, her hands clasped tightly behind her back, trying to shrink into the shadows. She felt like a ghost at the feast, an invisible servant whose purpose was to be knowledgeable but unheard. And then she saw him. Alistair Sterling held the center of the room without effort, a figure of dark, severe elegance in a perfectly tailored tuxedo. He moved with a chilling economy of motion, his presence a vortex of power that drew all eyes, including her own, against her will. He eventually made his way to her section, flanked by a small group of fawning investors. Alara's heart began a frantic, suffocating rhythm against her ribs. She kept her gaze fixed on a point just past his shoulder, praying he would ignore her. But he stopped directly in front of her. A cruel, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips as he turned to his guests. "And this is our conservation department," he announced, his voice carrying a note of dismissive amusement. He gestured not to the priceless art, but directly at her. "Miss Vance, perhaps you can enlighten Mr. Abernathy on the thematic significance of the serpent in Bellini's Agony in the Garden. A simple interpretation will suffice for our purposes." The question was a scalpel, designed to expose her, to mock her expertise in front of these titans of industry. All eyes turned to her, the air crackled with their polite, predatory curiosity. Alara felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck, the blood pounding in her ears. It was a deliberate, public execution of her dignity. Her throat felt tight, but she forced herself to meet his cold gray eyes. She opened her mouth and gave a concise, academic answer, her voice miraculously steady despite the tremor that shook her entire body. She spoke of theological symbolism, of Renaissance humanism, of the technical composition of the pigments. She refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. When she finished, there was a moment of surprised silence. Alistair's faint smile never wavered, but something new flickered in his eyes. Not respect, but a flash of irritation, as if a chess piece had made an unexpected and unwelcome move. He gave a curt nod, a silent dismissal, and steered his guests away, leaving her in the deafening wake of his departure. Alara stood frozen, her body trembling with a mixture of humiliation and a strange, defiant pride. She had survived. But the wound was deep and stinging. He had confirmed her greatest fear. To men like him, she was not a person with skill and passion. She was an object, a minor asset to be displayed and tested for their amusement. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of forced smiles and averted gazes. She felt the weight of his occasional, passing glances from across the room, cold and analytical, as if he were reevaluating a flawed acquisition. The glittering ballroom had become a cage, and she had never felt more trapped in her life. In the weeks that followed, a new, unsettling pattern emerged. Alistair Sterling began to appear in her studio. He never announced his visits. He would simply materialize in the doorway, a silent, dark-suited specter, his presence instantly charging the quiet air with an unbearable tension. His pretext was always business, inspecting the progress on a new acquisition, reviewing security protocols for the restoration wing. He would stand for long, unnerving stretches, watching her work with that same cold, dissecting gaze. He observed the steady, meticulous movements of her hands as she applied a tiny fleck of gold leaf to a damaged frame, his silence a heavy, judgmental blanket. He was an invasion, a violation of her only sanctuary, and she couldn't understand the motive behind his sudden predatory interest. Their interactions were a minefield of unspoken conflict. He would ask sharp, technical questions, his tone laced with a subtle challenge, as if daring her to be incompetent. The solvent you're using. What is its long-term effect on the gesso layer? He'd demand, his voice cutting through the silence. Ilara would answer with quiet, unwavering professionalism, her knowledge a shield against his intimidation. It's a reversible, non-aqueous solution, Mr. Sterling. Standard practice for 15th century tempera, she would reply, never looking up from her work for longer than a second. These brief, charged exchanges were the only words that passed between them. But beneath the surface, a different conversation was taking place. A silent, volatile negotiation of power, defiance, and a strange, burgeoning awareness that neither of them could name. One afternoon, while she was explaining the delicate process of removing centuries of discolored varnish from a portrait, he leaned closer to inspect the canvas. His arm brushed against hers, a fleeting, accidental contact of expensive wool against her simple cotton sleeve. A jolt of pure electricity shot through Ilara, so intense it made her gasp. Her entire body went rigid, every nerve ending screaming. She instinctively pulled back as if burned. He recoiled just as quickly, his jaw tightening, a flicker of something unreadable. Shock? Distaste? Crossing his features before his icy mask slammed back into place. The air between them thickened, suddenly heavy with a dangerous, forbidden energy. The silence that followed was no longer just judgmental. It was filled with the shocking, terrifying memory of that single, electrifying touch. The annual Sterling Foundation Masquerade Ball was the pinnacle of the city's social calendar, an event Ilara only knew through glossy photos in society magazines. She had no more intention of attending than she did of flying to the moon. But this year was different. A senior curator, a kind, perceptive woman named Isabel, who had taken a quiet liking to Ilara, approached her with a conspiratorial smile. "You work too hard," Isabel insisted, pressing a heavy garment bag into her hands. "For one night, you will not be staff. You will be a mystery." Inside was an elegant, midnight blue gown that shimmered like a star-dusted sky, and a delicate silver mask, intricately filigreed, that would hide her identity. The idea was terrifying, a transgression of every rule she lived by. Yet, a tiny, rebellious spark ignited within her. The thought of one night of anonymity, of shedding the heavy skin of Ilara Vance and becoming someone else entirely, was a temptation she couldn't entirely resist. It was a chance to walk through that gilded world not as an invisible servant but as an equal, protected by the anonymity of a mask. After days of internal debate, a strange, reckless impulse won out. On the night of the ball, she found herself standing before her small apartment mirror, transformed. The gown clung to her form, and the silver mask concealed her identity, leaving only her eyes and mouth visible. She looked like a stranger, a woman of mystery and elegance she didn't recognize. A tremor of fear and exhilarating freedom ran through her as she left her apartment for the foundation. The ballroom was even more breathtaking than she had imagined. A sea of masked figures in velvet and silk, dancing under the warm glow of crystal chandeliers. For the first time, Ilara felt not like an intruder, but a part of the spectacle. The mask was a liberation. She spoke to people, her voice losing its usual hesitant edge as she discussed the art surrounding them with a passion that was infectious. She caught the attention of a visiting collector from Geneva, a handsome, charming man who was clearly captivated by her insights and the mystery of her identity. He held her hand a moment too long, his eyes crinkling in a warm smile, and for a fleeting, dizzying moment, Ilara felt seen, desired, and powerful. From a shadowed alcove across the ballroom, Alistair Sterling watched. He had been observing the anonymous woman in the midnight blue gown for half the evening. intrigued by her quiet confidence and the effortless way she commanded the attention of his rivals. He felt an unfamiliar, ugly emotion coiling in his gut as he watched the Geneva collector lean in close, his hand lingering on hers. It was a hot, possessive spike of jealousy so raw and potent it made him physically tremble. It was an illogical, infuriating reaction to a woman he didn't even know. He told himself it was the proprietary anger of a king seeing a stranger hold court in his castle, but he knew, with a certainty that terrified him, that it was something far more personal and dangerously primal. His iron control, the foundation of his entire existence, shattered into 1,000 pieces. He didn't think. He simply moved. He crossed the ballroom in a straight, predatory line, his eyes locked on her. The crowd parted before him as if sensing the cold, dangerous energy radiating from his body. He reached her side and, without a word to the stunned collector, grabbed her arm. His grip was firm, inescapable. "You and I need to have a word," he said, his voice a low, threatening growl that was meant for her alone. He pulled her away from the lights and the music, dragging her toward a secluded corridor, the shimmering fabric of her gown whispering against the marble floors. The charming stranger, the music, the entire glittering fantasy, it all dissolved, leaving only the terrifying reality of his touch. He backed her into a darkened alcove, the shadows swallowing them whole, trapping them in an intimate, suffocating space. His body was a wall of heat and fury in front of her, his tall frame blocking the light from the ballroom. "The game is over," he snarled, his voice a low vibration that she felt in her bones. "Who are you?" His free hand came up, his fingers hooking into the delicate edge of her silver mask. He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling, and in the dim light she could see the wild, uncontrolled fury in his pale eyes, a fury mixed with something else, something that looked terrifyingly like raw, desperate hunger. The air was electric with violence and desire, a culmination of every unspoken word and forbidden touch that had passed between them. She was trapped, her back pressed against the cold marble wall, his furious, possessive energy pinning her in place. The scent of him, sandalwood and ozone, filled her senses, overwhelming and intoxicating. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird beating against the cage of her body. This was it. The moment she had feared her entire life. The loss of control. The surrender to a powerful, dangerous man. But beneath the terror, a shocking, treacherous current of desire surged through her. A part of her, a deeply buried, starved part, wanted this. She wanted him to see her, to finally break through the layers of invisibility she had so carefully constructed. As his fingers tightened on her mask, she held her breath, poised on the precipice of her own ruin. With a sharp, decisive tug, the silver filigree lifted away from her skin, taking with it her anonymity, her armor, her entire carefully constructed lie. The cool air of the corridor rushed against her suddenly bare face, a chilling baptism into a new, terrifying reality. For a heart-stopping second, Alistair's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. The raw fury in his eyes dissolved, replaced by a wave of stunned, disbelieving recognition. It was her, the quiet conservator, the insignificant employee he had publicly humiliated, the woman whose patient, steady hands he had found himself inexplicably watching for weeks. The name left his lips not as a sound, but as a breath of disbelief, a whisper that was both an accusation and a revelation. Vance. In that single word, the power dynamic of their entire universe tilted on its axis, shattering into a million irreparable pieces. The silence that followed was more profound than any sound, a vacuum where the glittering fantasy of the ball and the cold reality of their history collided. Ilara did not flinch. She did not look away. This was her great transgression. Not wearing the mask, but refusing to retreat now that it was gone. She met his gaze, her own eyes reflecting a maelstrom of fear and a defiant, newly unearthed strength. She was finally, truly seen by him, stripped of all pretense, and the terror of that exposure was matched only by a strange, exhilarating sense of release. He stared at her as if seeing a ghost, or perhaps seeing a real person for the very first time. The icy control that defined him had fractured, and in the cracks she saw a flicker of something raw and unguarded, a profound human confusion that was more arresting than his anger. His hand, which still held the silver mask, dropped to his side, the delicate metal clattering softly against the marble floor. The sound was a punctuation mark, the end of one story and the beginning of another. His other hand, the one that had gripped her arm with such bruising force, did not release her. Instead, his grip softened, his fingers uncurling from a fist to gently encircle her arm. Then, with a hesitation that seemed utterly alien to him, he lifted that hand to her face. His thumb, calloused and warm, brushed against her cheekbone, a gesture of such unexpected, shocking tenderness that it sent a tremor through her entire body. It was a question asked without words, a touch that was both an apology and a claim. Every instinct screamed at her to pull away, but a deeper, more starved instinct held her captive. And then he closed the small distance between them. The kiss was not gentle. It was a collision, a desperate, ravenous act, born of weeks of unspoken tension and a lifetime of loneliness. It was the taste of expensive whiskey, cold fury, and a profound, shocking hunger. His lips were firm, demanding, moving against hers with an urgency that stole her breath and shattered her resolve. This was the ruin her mother had warned her about, the complete and utter surrender to a force she could not control. Yet as his arm snaked around her waist, pulling her flush against the hard lines of his body, the fear was consumed by a tidal wave of sensation. Her hands, which had been pressed uselessly against his chest, crept upward, her fingers tangling in the fine, dark hair at the nape of his neck, pulling him closer. This was a transgression far deeper than attending a party. It was a betrayal of her own carefully constructed identity, a willing demolition of the fortress she had spent her life building. The kiss deepened, becoming a frantic, silent conversation. He was communicating his raw, possessive need, the jealousy that had ripped through his iron control, and she, in turn, was answering with her own long-buried desires, a lifetime of untouched, unexpressed longing erupting in a single, cataclysmic moment. She was no longer just the conservator, the quiet girl who mended broken things. She was a woman, alive and aching, and she was meeting his fire with a hidden inferno of her own. The cold marble wall at her back was the only thing grounding her in a world that had suddenly dissolved into nothing but heat, pressure, and the intoxicating reality of his touch. He broke the kiss with a ragged gasp, resting his forehead against hers. His chest heaved, his breathing as labored and unsteady as her own. The mask of the cold, untouchable billionaire was gone, replaced by the face of a man utterly undone. "I don't," he began, his voice a raw, broken whisper against her skin. "I don't understand this." It was the most vulnerable thing she had ever heard him say, a confession of his own confusion and loss of control that was more intimate than the kiss itself. In that moment he was not the formidable Alistair Sterling, benefactor and king. He was just a man, wounded and lost, reaching for something he couldn't comprehend but desperately needed. It was this crack in his armor, this admission of his own humanity, that finally and completely disarmed her. Her fear, the constant, low-level hum that had been the soundtrack of her life, fell silent. In its place, a profound and terrifying empathy bloomed. Her hands, which had been clinging to him, moved with a will of their own. She brought one hand to his face, her fingers tracing the sharp, tense line of his jaw with the same gentle, diagnostic touch she used on a fragile canvas. She was searching for the fractures, for the history of the damage beneath the perfect polished surface. It was a gesture of pure instinct, the healer in her reaching for the wound in him. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch, with a subtle, almost imperceptible surrender. It was an act of trust so profound, so out of character, that it sealed their fate. They were no longer adversaries. They were two broken halves of a whole she never knew existed. Without another word he took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers with a new, urgent purpose. The anger was gone, replaced by a quiet, determined intensity. He turned and led her away from the alcove, away from the distant, muffled sounds of the masquerade ball. They moved through the vast, silent galleries of the sleeping museum, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. They passed by masterpieces that depicted epic love and tragic loss, their own silent drama unfolding under the watchful eyes of painted saints and stoic marble gods. This was the ultimate transgression. She, the humble employee, was walking hand in hand with the king through his empty castle, leaving behind the world of rules and roles to enter a dangerous, uncharted territory defined only by the powerful, undeniable connection that now bound them together. He led her not to the main exit, but to a private elevator concealed behind a paneled wall. The ride upward was silent, the air thick with anticipation and the unspoken gravity of their decision. The doors opened directly into his private office, a sprawling, minimalist space high above the museum, with a floor-to-ceiling window that revealed the glittering, indifferent city below. The room was like him, cold, precise, and impeccably curated, filled with sharp angles, dark leather, and modern art that was more intellectual than emotional. Her presence in her shimmering blue gown was a splash of soft, romantic chaos in his sterile, ordered world. He released her hand only to walk to the heavy oak door and engage the lock. The soft, definitive click echoed in the silence, sealing them in, shutting the rest of the world out. He turned to face her from across the room, and the distance felt both immense and insignificant. The last barrier had fallen, the last rule had been broken. He looked at her now with an expression of raw, unguarded possession, his pale eyes burning with an intensity that stripped away the last of her defenses. This was no longer about a mask, a dress, or a stolen dance. It was about the terrifying, exhilarating recognition of a kindred soul, a loneliness in him that called to the loneliness in her. She had spent her entire life running from this exact moment, from this exact man. And now, standing in the heart of his power, she felt no fear, only a profound and terrifying sense of coming home. She had not just transgressed, she had been reborn. The dawn that followed was a cruel, sterile gray, filtering through the blinds of her small bedroom and illuminating a world that felt fundamentally altered. Ilara woke up alone, the scent of him a phantom on her skin, the memory of his office, the cold leather, the vast window overlooking the city, a surreal and damning counterpoint to her own modest reality. The night replayed in her mind not as a memory but as a brand, a searing imprint of transgression and surrender. The click of his office lock echoed in the silence, a sound that had sealed them in and had now, she feared, sealed her fate. She had walked into the heart of the fire she'd spent her life avoiding, and the silence of the morning after felt like the cold, quiet devastation of ashes, a profound emptiness where a fortress used to be. His rejection was as swift and impersonal as a corporate memo. 2 days later, an email from his executive assistant, a woman with a name but no face, announced that Mr. Sterling had been called away on urgent international business and would be unreachable for the foreseeable future. There was no personal note, no explanation, just a clean, surgical severance. For Ilara, the words were a verdict. She had been a momentary lapse in his impenetrable control, a brief, regrettable fever that had now been cured by distance. His silence wasn't an absence, it was a statement, a deliberate erasure of their shared intimacy. He had simply deleted the event, and her along with it. The formidable, powerful man had retreated behind his walls of wealth and distance, leaving her alone to grapple with the wreckage of the one night she had dared to feel alive. Her work, once a meticulous and calming ritual, became a form of torture. The Sterling Foundation was no longer her sanctuary. It was a museum of their brief, catastrophic history. The quiet alcove where he had torn away her mask felt haunted. The private elevator, a portal to a world she had briefly touched and been violently ejected from. Her hands, once so steady and precise, now trembled as she attempted the delicate work of in-painting. She would stare at the fractured surface of a centuries-old canvas, seeing only the cracks he had created in her own carefully preserved life. Other conservators would ask if she was unwell, their concerned glances feeling like accusations. She would murmur excuses about a lack of sleep, retreating further into a shell of isolation, her silence a heavy cloak for the shame and confusion that raged within her. The change in her was a scent her grandmother could detect like a coming storm. During one of their weekly, suffocating visits, the old woman paused while pouring tea, her rheumy eyes narrowing on Ilara's face. "You have the look of your mother about you," she said, her voice thin and sharp as a needle. The words were a quiet bomb, detonating in the cramped, lavender-scented room. It was not a compliment. It was a curse, an accusation that Ilara had been careless, that she had risked repeating a history of ruin. Ilara offered no defense, for there was none to give. The truth of her grandmother's observation was a physical weight, pressing the air from her lungs. She had not only betrayed herself, and her lifelong vows of caution. She felt she had desecrated her mother's memory, proving herself just as weak, just as foolish. A deep, gnawing guilt took root in her soul, poisoning everything. Sleep became a battleground of fragmented images, the fury in his pale eyes, the shocking gentleness of his thumb on her cheek, the taste of whiskey and desperation on his lips. She would wake with a gasp, her body aching with a phantom longing that quickly curdled into self-loathing. She felt used, but the most painful part was that she had been a willing participant in her own undoing. She had met his hunger with a desperate, starved hunger of her own. In the merciless light of day, that desire felt shameful. A weakness that confirmed her mother's tragic flaw was a hereditary disease. She had allowed a powerful man to breach her defenses, and his subsequent disappearance felt like the inevitable, punishing consequence she had always been taught to expect. Weeks bled into a month. His name was never spoken at the foundation, his absence a void that everyone pretended not to notice. Then one morning, while scrolling through the news on her phone, she saw a small article in a financial journal. It detailed a minor but unexpected instability in Sterling Industries' European market shares, quoting an anonymous insider who attributed it to Alistair's uncharacteristic and prolonged absence and erratic decision-making from his Geneva estate. The words sent a strange, painful jolt through her. He was not indifferent. He had not simply moved on. The cold, controlled machine was malfunctioning. He was not just hiding from her, he was hiding from the chaos she had unleashed within him. The knowledge that he was suffering too was no comfort. It only deepened the tragedy, proof that their connection was a poison affecting them both. One afternoon, while meticulously cleaning a patch of grime from a forgotten corner of a vast Baroque canvas, Ilara paused. She saw her own reflection in the dark, varnished surface, a pale, haunted face with shadowed eyes. She looked like a ghost, but as she stared, another memory surfaced, pushing through the fog of her shame. She remembered the raw confusion in his voice, the broken whisper of, "I don't understand this." In that moment, he had been the vulnerable one, stripped of his power and control. She had not been a passive victim succumbing to a predator. She had been a force of nature in her own right, a woman whose quiet presence had been enough to shatter the fortress of a man like Alistair Sterling. A new feeling, fragile but persistent, began to stir in her chest, not pride, but a dawning recognition of her own hidden strength. That recognition slowly solidified into a resolve. She could allow this to be the defining tragedy of her life, the story she would tell herself forever to justify her fear. Or she could claim it. She could own the transgression, the desire, the pain, and the strength it had revealed. Her first act of rebellion was small. She went home and cleaned her apartment with a furious energy, scrubbing away not just dust but the lingering miasma of her self-pity. She rearranged the furniture, breaking the static, defensive patterns of her old life. She pulled out a dusty set of charcoal pencils and a sketchbook, and for the first time in years she began to draw, not for work, but for herself. The bold, dark lines on the page were a reclamation, a refusal to be erased by his silence. Later that week, she opened the small velvet box on her dresser and took out her mother's silver locket. For her entire life, the smiling face in the tiny photograph had been a warning, a memento mori of a woman destroyed by love. But now, looking at the bright, hopeful eyes, Ilara felt a profound and aching pity. Her mother's mistake was not in her capacity to feel, but in her inability to survive the feeling. She had allowed a man to become the sole architect of her world, and when he left, the world collapsed. Ilara closed the locket with a soft click, a quiet vow forming in her heart. She would not make the same mistake. Her night with Alistair was not the end of her story. It was the violent, fiery beginning of a new one, a story she alone would write. That night, she broke another rule. She returned to the foundation after hours, her key turning in the lock of the main entrance with a definitive click. She walked through the silent, shadowed galleries, her footsteps echoing on the marble, no longer a frightened ghost but the quiet mistress of the domain. She made her way to the restoration studio and stood in the doorway, looking into the space where he had first appeared, where he had watched her with those cold, assessing eyes. The fear was still there, a faint, familiar tremor, but it was no longer her master. She walked to her easel, picked up her finest sable hair brush, and with a hand that was now perfectly, miraculously steady, she touched its tip to the damaged face of the painted noblewoman, beginning the patient, healing work of making something broken whole again. 3 months passed, the city exchanging its autumn golds for the stark, crystalline beauty of winter. The change was mirrored in Alara. A quiet, unshakable self-possession had settled deep within her, replacing the constant, low hum of anxiety that had been the soundtrack of her life. Her work in the studio was no longer an escape, but a practice of profound, focused presence. The 17th-century noblewoman on her easel was whole again, the web of fractures on her cheek gone, her painted gaze now serene and unbroken. Alara had not just mended the canvas. She had meticulously pieced herself back together, finding a strength not in the avoidance of pain, but in the patient, healing work of surviving it. Her studio was once again her sanctuary, but it was no longer a fortress to hide within. It was a workshop where she was actively forging a new self from the fragments of the old. The peace was disturbed one frigid Tuesday afternoon by the arrival of a package. It was not delivered through the Foundation's efficient but impersonal internal mail system. A private courier, his face ruddy from the cold, hand-delivered it to her supervisor, who brought it to the studio with a curious frown. It was a flat, rectangular box, wrapped in plain brown paper, addressed to her in a simple, typed font. There was no return address, no clue as to its origin. She took it from her supervisor with a murmured thanks, her heart beginning a slow, heavy drumbeat against her ribs. She waited until she was alone, the silence of the studio amplifying the sound of her own breathing, and placed the mysterious object on her workbench. It sat there, an unnerving, silent testament to a story she thought had ended. Her fingers, now so steady in her work, trembled as she carefully tore away the paper. Inside, resting on a bed of black velvet, was not a letter, not a jewel, but a small, unframed canvas. It was a drawing, a stunningly intimate portrait rendered in charcoal and white chalk. It depicted a pair of hands. Her hands. They were captured in a moment of intense concentration. One hand holding a fine-tipped brush poised just above a surface, the other resting gently on the edge of a frame, a gesture of both healing and reverence. The detail was breathtaking, capturing the faint scar on her knuckle, the determined set of her fingers. It was an artist's study, but it was more than that. It was an act of profound, almost devotional observation. She knew, with a certainty that stole the air from her lungs, that Alistair had drawn this. A wave of vertigo washed over her. She sank into her chair, her gaze locked on the image, on the undeniable proof that he had not forgotten. This was his reply to the chaos of their last night together, his answer to the silence that had followed. He had used the only language he had left, the only one he truly trusted, the language of art. He hadn't seen her as a conquest, a momentary lapse, or a simple employee. He had seen her in her element, in her power. He had captured not her face, which could be masked, but the very essence of her soul as it was expressed through her hands. A single hot tear escaped her eye and fell onto the dark velvet lining, a small, glistening mark of absolution. He had not just seen her, he had understood her in a way no one else ever had. She lifted the drawing from its box with the same reverent care she would give a priceless artifact. She did not know if she would ever see him again. The drawing was an apology, a confession, perhaps even a farewell. But in a way, it didn't matter. The crushing weight of her shame, the feeling of being a used and discarded object, lifted completely, dissolving into the cold winter air. He had not erased her, he had immortalized her. His silence had forced her to find her own strength, and his art had now given her the priceless gift of her own reflection, seen through the eyes of the one man who had truly broken through her walls. She walked to a small, empty easel in the corner and placed the portrait upon it, a quiet monument not to him, but to the woman she had become because of him. That evening, as she walked home, the city lights seemed sharper, the winter air cleaner. The future was no longer a threat to be defended against, but a vast, unpainted canvas, its potential both terrifying and exhilarating. She had learned that the deepest wounds were not inflicted by others, but by the fears we allow to govern us. The fortress around her heart was gone, not because he had stormed it, but because she had finally found the courage to walk out of its gates herself. The story of Elara Vance and Alistair Sterling was unfinished, a composition of light and shadow still taking shape, but her own story, the one she was now creating with her own steady hands, had finally, truly begun. If this journey of a soul learning to mend itself resonated with you, we invite you to subscribe, like, and share this story, and tell us in the comments what it means to find strength in your own scars.